Do you remember the days when heroes were simple and straightforward, their virtues shining brighter than the sun, and their flaws seeming like mere shadows? Ancient myths seem to tell us about nobility and self-sacrifice, but if you look closer, you can see features behind the shining armor of many legendary figures that inspire awe rather than admiration. Among such figures, Achilles stands out in particular, a name that today conjures up the image of a fearless warrior, but hides something much more complex and perhaps frightening. Here, we will lift the veil on his true nature by exploring those aspects of his life that often remain in the shadows. Achilles, whose name echoes through the centuries, was no ordinary man. He was the son of the mortal king Peleus of Thessaly and the sea nymph Thetis, one of the 50 Nereids, daughters of Nereus and Doris. This semi-divine origin planted the seed of extraordinary strength in him at birth, but also a certain destructive potential. Imagine the scene. A sea goddess, her hair flowing like waves and her eyes reflecting the depths of the ocean, leaning over her newborn baby. She is driven not only by maternal love, but also by fear for his mortal nature. She knew of the prophecy that predicted Achilles would either have a long but inglorious life, or a short but glorious one, ending in early death. Seeking to grant her son immortality, to make him invulnerable to earthly weapons, Thetis took a desperate step. She dipped the baby in the sacred waters of the river Styx, which flowed around the underworld kingdom of Hades. It was believed that touching these waters granted invulnerability, making the flesh as hard as adamant. Thetis held her son by the heel, and it was this spot, the only one not washed by the waters of the Styx, that remained vulnerable, a symbol of his dual nature, his mortal weakness in a shell of almost divine power. That moment when the baby's delicate skin touched the dark, cold waters of the river of the dead, forever imprinted on his soul not only the gift of invulnerability, but also a premonition of the inevitable tragedy that would come from his own, not always controllable power. After this fateful ritual, the upbringing of the young Achilles was entrusted to the wise centaur Chiron, who lived on Mount Pelion. Chiron was known as the mentor of many heroes, such as Jason, Hercules, and Asclepius. He taught them not only the art of war, spear and sword fighting, but also music, medicine, and philosophy. However, in the case of Achilles, Chiron, despite his wisdom, was unable to completely curb his innate ferocity. As the Roman poet Stasius noted in his epic poem Achillida, describing the hero's early years, ferocity was nourished in his soul with his mother's milk. This is not just a poetic metaphor. It is an indication that aggression and uncontrollable force were an integral part of his being from the very beginning. Achilles' semi-divine status and superhuman power, combined with this inner, untamed temperament, made him not just a great hero, but a being whose strength bordered on monstrosity, predetermining his dark, bloody path. He was like a raging storm, capable of bringing salvation, but more often than not leaving only destruction in its wake. When the Trojan War broke out, Achilles joined the Achaean army, driven by a thirst for glory that had been prophesied to him. It was here, beneath the walls of ancient Troy, that his true nature was revealed in all its unsightly fullness. In Homer's immortal poem, the Iliad, Achilles appears to the reader not as a noble warrior whose heart is filled with valor and honor, but as the embodiment of uncontrollable, destructive rage, the very wrath of Achilles with which the narrative begins. The conflict that sparked his terrible anger arose over the captive Briseis. She was Achilles' war booty, captured by him during the siege of the city of Lyrnessus. When Agamemnon, the supreme leader of the Achaeans, was forced to return his own captive, Chryseis, to appease the god Apollo, he demanded Briseis for himself as compensation. This act was not merely an insult, but a direct attack on Achilles' honor, a challenge to his authority and status in the army. Achilles' fury was boundless. He refused to fight, leaving the battle with his Myrmidon warriors, thereby condemning his allies to certain death. Imagine a huge army whose main striking force, like a torn-out heart, suddenly leaves the battlefield. For 10 days, the Achaeans suffered crushing defeats, with the Trojans pushing them back to their ships and threatening them with complete destruction. His return to battle came only after the most terrible loss for him, the death of Patroclus, his closest friend and comrade in arms. Patroclus, trying to stop the Trojan advance, put on Achilles' armor and entered the battle, but was killed by the Trojan prince Hector. This death was the last straw, plunging Achilles into an abyss of mad, all-consuming grief and rage. He returned to the battlefield not to defend his comrades, but for merciless revenge. His appearance on the battlefield was like a natural disaster. He killed everyone who crossed his path, sparing no one. The river Scamander ran red with blood, dammed up with the bodies of the Trojans he had killed. The culmination of this bloody massacre was his duel with Hector, the killer of Patroclus. After a fierce battle, Achilles killed the Trojan prince, but his thirst for revenge did not subside. In an act of unprecedented cruelty that shocked even the gods and heroes of the time, Achilles desecrated Hector's body. He pierced the tendons on both heels of the slain hero, threaded straps through them, and tied the body to his chariot. Then, under the gaze of the stunned Trojans and Achaeans, he raced around the walls of Troy 3 times, dragging Hector's body through the dust. Homer, describing this chilling episode, writes, "He tied Hector's feet to his chariot and dragged him around Patroclus's tomb." This episode, which is often softened or omitted in modern adaptations and retellings of myths, reveals the truly monstrous nature of Achilles, not only as a warrior capable of great deeds, but also as a creature whose rage could overshadow any notion of honor, dignity, and even basic humanity. Thus, from his cradle to the climax of his rage beneath the walls of Troy, Achilles appears not simply as a hero of myth, but as a complex, sometimes frightening, embodiment of power bordering on monstrosity. Often, when we talk about the heroes of ancient Greece, we see idealized images, polished by centuries. We are used to seeing them as the embodiment of valor, wisdom, and justice. However, if we look more closely, behind the shining facade of heroism and glory, we can discover much darker traits hidden from the general public. Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War, is a striking example of this. His exploits, celebrated in the Iliad, seem to be the pinnacle of heroism. But beyond this great epic lies a series of deeds that make us shudder and rethink his image. The story of Achilles is not limited to the walls of Troy and the furious battles described by Homer. Before his name became synonymous with unbridled fury at Ilion, and even parallel to the main events, there were episodes that rarely make it into textbooks and popular retellings of myths. These events, recorded in lesser-known but no less significant ancient Greek texts, such as the epic cycle that included, for example, the Cypria, reveal Achilles from a completely different angle, as a ruthless conqueror capable of acts of mass violence. One such episode is the massacre on the island of Tenedos. Imagine, the Achaean fleet, huge as a floating city, drops anchor off the coast of a peaceful island. The inhabitants, not expecting an attack, greet the strangers with curiosity, perhaps, or even with alarm. But instead of peaceful dialogue, or at least the standard looting of the time, Achilles and his warriors stage a veritable massacre. They do not simply seize supplies or take prisoners. They destroy the peaceful inhabitants, including women and children. This is not a battle with an armed enemy. It is an act of extermination that has no strategic meaning, but clearly demonstrates Achilles' pathological tendency towards violence. It was more than just a military necessity. It was a demonstration of his willingness to use extreme cruelty for no apparent reason, making his actions more like those of a wild beast than a noble warrior. Another equally telling episode involves King Telephus. When the Achaeans mistakenly landed in Mysia, mistaking it for Troy, Achilles engaged in battle with the local king, Telephus. In this battle, Achilles wounded Telephus with his spear. The wound was unusual. It did not heal, festered, and caused unbearable suffering. King Telephus suffered from this wound for 10 years until the oracle predicted that only the one who inflicted the wound could heal him, and only with the help of the same spear. And here Achilles' strange, almost capricious cruelty manifests itself. He does not immediately rush to help. No, he seems to enjoy Telephus's suffering, delaying the moment of healing. And only after much persuasion, perhaps out of a desire to demonstrate his power over life and death, does he agree to apply the rust from his spear to the wound, which miraculously heals the king. This act, where inflicting pain is followed by healing, does not appear to be noble, but rather a powerful being playing with a person's fate, emphasizing his unpredictable and egocentric nature. He is like a child who first breaks a toy and then tries to fix it, not out of remorse, but out of caprice. Finally, there is another episode, often ignored in popular retellings, but mentioned in ancient sources, such as the epic poem Ethiopia, attributed to Arctinus of Miletus. This is the story of the Amazon Penthesilea. She, the queen of the Amazons, came to the aid of Troy after Hector's death. She was defeated in a duel with Achilles. But even here, Achilles did not show the respect for a fallen enemy that was customary for a warrior. He did not simply kill her. In some versions of the myth, he enjoyed her death, and then, removing her helmet, was struck by her beauty. Some sources even say that he felt a strange, perverted attraction to her after taking her life, which disgusted even his comrades, in particular Thersites, for which Achilles killed him. These exploits, rarely mentioned in popular culture, do not simply complement Achilles' image, they fundamentally change it, emphasizing his pathological tendency towards violence, lack of empathy, and willingness to transgress generally accepted moral norms, which makes him a much more complex and perhaps disturbing figure than is commonly believed. A logical question arises. If Achilles committed such acts, why is he known to the general public primarily as an impeccable hero? The answer does not lie in the fact that historians hid these facts. On the contrary, classical scholars, philologists, and archaeologists have carefully analyzed and continue to analyze these episodes, studying them in the context of ancient texts, comparing different versions of myths, and searching for grains of truth in millennia-old legends. They are well aware of each of the events mentioned here. The problem lies in how these ancient stories have been interpreted and adapted over the centuries for the mass consciousness. Popular interpretations, especially since the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, have often romanticized the image of Achilles, emphasizing exclusively his heroism, fearlessness, and military prowess, while ignoring or downplaying his cruelty. This was done not out of malice, but out of cultural and ideological preferences. At a time when the foundations of European civilization were being laid, ideals were needed. An image of the perfect warrior, a symbol of valor and honor, was needed for generations to emulate. And Achilles, with his invincibility and tragic fate, was ideal for this role. As the outstanding American classicist Bernard Knox, one of the leading researchers of Homer and Greek tragedy of the 20th century, whose works were published in such authoritative publications as Harvard University Press and Cambridge University Press, explained, "The image of Achilles has been polished over the centuries to serve as an ideal of valor." This comparison with polishing is very accurate. Imagine an ancient coin that originally had many irregularities and sharp edges. Over time, under the influence of human hands, it wears away, becomes smooth, its sharp edges are smoothed out, and some details disappear altogether. The same thing happened with the image of Achilles. His rough edges, his dark sides, his cruelty, all of this was gradually smoothed out so that he could shine as a flawless symbol. Such selectivity in the representation of the image arose due to certain cultural demands. The Renaissance, with its return to ancient ideals, and the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on rationalism and humanism, preferred to see him not as a bloodthirsty monster, but as a noble warrior whose strength served higher goals, even if those goals were sometimes selfish. In other words, society needed not the Achilles who had dragged Hector's body, but the one who wept over Patroclus, who was loyal to his friend, who was ready to die for glory. This interpretation meant that many of his dark deeds remained unknown to the general public. They were not forgotten by historians or scholars, but they were pushed to the periphery of mass consciousness, hidden behind a veil of romanticized heroism. This allowed the myth of the flawless hero to be preserved, inspiring artists, poets, and military leaders for millennia. But behind this polished surface, beneath the layer of praise and legends, there always lurked a complex, contradictory, and at times truly frightening personality. And perhaps it is this understanding that makes ancient myths so vivid and relevant today. They remind us that even the greatest heroes are not without flaws, that light and darkness always go hand in hand, and that true history, unlike fairy tales, is rarely simple and unambiguous. By exploring these forgotten aspects, we do not denigrate Achilles' memory, but gain a more complete and honest picture of him, of ancient Greece, and ultimately of human nature itself, which always remains a mystery full of contradictions. Achilles remains one of the most controversial symbols of Greek mythology, a hero whose fame is built on a foundation of cruelty. His story reminds us that even the greatest legends carry dark secrets. By understanding this duality, we gain a deeper insight into the ancient worldview, where the divine and the monstrous often went hand in hand. Let his image serve as a warning. True greatness is rarely without flaw.